Like, all right, guys. So today we're going to be talking about introducing JavaScript logic into our HTML pages. So if you remember our analogy from a couple days ago, we talked about front-end web development. We have HTML. This is our structure of our document. So I kind of call it just like a bare bones or the structure of what we're dealing with. We also have a browser which actually takes that structure and then renders something with it. So in this case, takes a skeleton, kind of wraps it with a skin so that gives a presentation of the content. Then we have CSS. So we kind of style up our rendered page so that we have something more presentable. So far we've been doing these three portions of front-end development, and we're just creating something that has content and has some style and some visual presentation. But what if we want to do something more? Like, what if we want something that actually can make decisions and do something more dynamic than just showing content? Well, that's where JavaScript comes into play. So we talked about the brain, that your JavaScript content or your JavaScript code is the brains of the operation. It's actually going to make your pages smarter and be able to actually react to your end user. All right. So again, we've been creating static pages. We've used this term in programming a lot. So again, static in the natural sense, you might think of like when you rub your feet on a carpet and then go touch someone, you have static electricity that way. But static in a programming sense just means it's constant or the same. So we've mentioned static methods in the past when we're developing in Python. That just means it's a method that's not going to change anything. It's going to be consistent. So static in static web pages just show content. The structure, every time you reload that page, the HTML is going to be the same. You're going to see the same thing every time for static web pages using HTML and CSS. When we introduce JavaScript, we have the ability to make dynamic web pages. This is where our web pages can actually react to user input. So if they click on a button, something special can happen. If they type something into an input, we can use that value. Also, JavaScript allows us to manipulate the HTML structure so that, again, you could actually change what elements are on the HTML page without actually having to manually go into the HTML document and edit it yourself. JavaScript can do that for us dynamically. All right, so the question is, how does JavaScript interact with HTML documents? So if we think about it, JavaScript is a programming language. HTML is a markup language used to create web documents. And then JavaScript is a programming language that interacts with logical objects. So, when we kind of, went back to OOP development, we have objects, like we might have a human class that has properties on it. Well, we could interact with those properties, in a programming language. HTML doesn't really have that. HTML just has, a markup language that says, hey, here's how I want to present content. How do these two kind of worlds talk to each other? Right? They're kind of confused. Like we operate in different manners. JavaScript again uses like objects. HTML just presents content. The answer here is the DOM. So the DOM kind of provides an interface between an HTML document and a JavaScript document. All right, so again, we're gonna get to know the DOM a little better. So DOM, what is the DOM? The DOM stands for Document Object Model. It is a representation of HTML documents in an object-oriented manner. So that buzzword kind of comes up again, OOP development, object orientation. That's what the DOM is actually doing. It's taking your HTML document, which is just, it's a document that's saying, hey, present this content in this manner. But we actually convert that to something that has objects and properties that can be used in again, OOP manner. So the DOM is actually represented as a tree structure that contains nodes. And then each node is an element from your HTML document. So again, if you imagine the head section and the body section, each of those would be nodes on this tree, individual. And like those would be siblings because the head section and the body section are usually, at the same level, which is next to each other. Again, as I mentioned, the DOM is an interface between the HTML document and your backend coding language. Normally for web development, JavaScript is like the de facto programming language, but you're not limited to JavaScript to interact with HTML pages. Python can do it. Other programming languages can have access to the DOM. So the DOM, just to be clear, is not specific to JavaScript. It's just a model that gives you access to various portions of your HTML document. And you could access that through programming languages such as JavaScript or others, should you need it. The DOM is automatically created by the browser when it loads a web page. So it's not something that you had to generate. it just automatically kind of rendered that model is created for you by your browser. So it's kind of nice of the browser to do that for us so that we could use programming languages to access elements in the HTML document. So as I mentioned, it's a tree structure. So this is a visual example of how the DOM is kind of structured. So at the top, you have something called the document, and then you have some child nodes. The first child node, if we remember when we create an HTML document, is the HTML element. That has children elements, right? So we create a head section, a body section. So those are going to be child nodes of the HTML object. Again, this is an object. This is a representation of the HTML elements. So the DOM just creates an object that has child elements. So these are going to be properties, or I guess these are going to be contained within the HTML object. Inside the HTML object, we have a head object. In that, we might have more child elements. In this case, we might have a title. And that title, you can set the title to whatever you want. This element's going to have a property of text that we can access through the model. And so that'd be the title of the page. Again, we might have a body that might have a header, an anchor. The anchor might have attributes and the value for the content. So again, it's just going to be a tree. So if you're not familiar with trees, hopefully our data structures presentation today will kind of touch upon them. But a tree, again, just has nodes and then child leaves. So again, a tree, if you imagine it, has branches. So you kind of see that branching here. Each branch is going to contain some data and then might have additional children from it. What questions do you guys have about the structure that we're talking about here? Does that make sense, how it's organized? Is it hard to see? I'm not sure if it renders the best here. We do have this on our curriculum page, so probably a larger image of it. Where are we? So yeah, we have this tree structure, kind of a very large image, but kind of shows you, what's going on here. We have elements, we have properties, and attributes.
Can you think of it almost like how whenever you're indenting your HTML, is it kind of similar where you're nesting stuff and then that's the branch itself?
Yep. That's how the DOM's getting created. So if we go back to an HTML example, I guess I lost my code. Let's actually grab some code from our curriculum page. If you guys want to follow along, just we have the examples kind of coded initially. So I'm going to just copy what we have here and we'll talk about it. So here we have a pretty standard HTML document. We have some additional things that we'll need to talk about, but we have our head section. So as Alex was saying, inside the head section, we have like a nested title element. So yeah, this title is considered a child of this head element. And in the DOM, this node will contain various numbers of children elements. So again, yeah, visually, you can kind of see it if you tab it correctly. You have your parent that has children, in this case, head and body, and those can have further children in this case. Yep, that is how it's represented. So that's how the tree structure is kind of made up automatically. Again, the browser's doing this for you. This is not something that you had to manually assemble yourself. The convenience is already baked in. So then we get to the question. So now that we kind of know that the DOM exists, we'll see how we can interact with it. To interact with it, we use JavaScript. How can we actually use JavaScript in the HTML document? So there's two general ways to go about it. You could do it internally or have an external JavaScript document. This is very similar to CSS, where you can kind of have the style just written, kind of baked into the web page, or you can have an external document that can house the styles and allows you to share that functionality or that styling across multiple web pages. In the same respect, having an external JavaScript file usually is the way to go, so that you could share functionality between web pages, assuming that you need to do similar items. All right, so the magic here comes from this new HTML tag called script that we've not talked about before. So script will let you actually write JavaScript in your HTML files or reference an external JavaScript file to include in your HTML. So if we want to do this internally, we could use the script tag. The script tag usually should be placed into your head section, but doesn't always have to go in your head section. You can actually have your script tags inside your body section if you want also. But normally it's, makes sense to just put it in the head, kind of centralize it there. So here you open a script tag, and then here where I have this comment, you could add just pure JavaScript code. It doesn't have to be formatted any differently. Just start writing JavaScript inside the script opening tag and closing tag. This will be JavaScript syntax, nothing special going on there. All right, so this is if you want to have it an internal script to your HTML page. again, your head section that we talked about before, add a new script element, and then add your content, your JavaScript content there. We can also link externally. Again, this is probably the more common way we're going to be doing it, is you have the script tag. This has an attribute called SRC, short form for source. There, you just point it to your JavaScript file that you want to include in this HTML file. Just similar to CSS files, you can have multiple JavaScript files that you incorporate. So you don't have to be limited to one file. We've talked about breaking up, making it more modular. So usually you might have multiple JavaScript files based on the functionality you're trying to provide or include. There's this mysterious word here called defer. This is kind of important to have because normally your HTML files can be executed or read from top down. So when it gets to the script tag in your head section, it's actually going to try to load this file right away. Sometimes that's going to be totally fine. Usually you're going to want to actually have access to the DOM, the document object model that we talked about, with your JavaScript. To assure that the DOM has been built and fully assembled, you want to use a defer keyword. The defer keyword will basically say, load this script after everything else on this page is loaded. It's going to defer that loading until later. This, again, allows us to fully load the page and that DOM to be fully created so that when this JavaScript executes, that DOM is guaranteed to exist versus we might not have every element that we need right away when the script gets executed. So always kind of remember to have that defer keyword. There's other ways to go about that. So instead of having this defer keyword, you can include your script tag at the very, very bottom of your body section. As I mentioned, your script tag does not have to be in your head section. It can be in your body. So if you don't want to use the defer keyword or just forget about it, you can put your script script element at the as your last line in your body section. And it'll do the same thing. It'll just load it last because again, your browser just reads your HTML document top down. It's not smart or doesn't really parse in some other manner. All right, so that's how we link an external script. Any questions about internal or external? So use the script tag, either add your JavaScript as content to your script element or have a SRC attribute that points to your JavaScript file. All right, don't forget your defer keyword. All right, let's talk about the DOM, which we talked about earlier, and JavaScript. So again, the DOM provides an interface for your programming language, in this case, JavaScript, to interact with your HTML document. There's a document object that is provided for you automatically. It's not something you had to create. It just exists from the DOM, and you have access to it in your JavaScript. There are a few common methods. These aren't the only methods. There's actually a whole list of them, so you can kind of Google them. There's probably at least a dozen, maybe 24 methods for accessing various parts of your HTML document. But these 5, I would say, are the most common and probably the only ones you'll be using for your challenges. So we have document get element by ID. Luckily, these methods are named pretty descriptively, so it shouldn't be a surprise as to what they do. So get element by ID will take in an ID name of an element that you have in your HTML document. So if we peeked at what we had here, so let's see, I have an ID of input name, for example. I would just provide input name into my get element by ID, and that'll allow me to access that element. I'll get an object representation of that element from my HTML document. So let's make sure we understand what's the terminology here. It's an object representation. It's a model of the actual HTML element in your document. You can also access elements, again, this is plural, note the S here, by class name. So again, you can apply a class to multiple elements versus ID should be unique, and you should only have at most one element by an ID name. Class name, again, can be shared. So you have multiple classes between various elements. If you use get elements by class name, you get an array. You get an array of elements back, or element objects. Likewise, you do by tag. So let's say you want to grab all the paragraph elements from your page. You just provide the tag name. In this case, I just put the letter P in quotation marks. P is the tag for paragraph. If you want to do for divs, you put the name of div as your input, and then in strings, in quotations, meaning a string value, and then you'll get all the elements that are of type div or of paragraph or whatever you're looking for. All right, so the top three methods here are basically doing it the HTML way. You're accessing by ID or class name or tag. You also do it with CSS selectors, and these are quite handy when you want to get more specific. So you do query selector or query selector all. The only difference between these two is that the all version returns multiple items versus query selector will return at most one item to you. The input here is the same selectors that you use in CSS. So for example, if I want to target my input name, the way we do it in CSS, if you remember, let me just add a comment here. In CSS, we use the hashtag and then input name. So I would do the same thing for query selector. I use that hashtag, and that'll be my input for query selector or query selector all. Again, if you do it by ID, usually you'll use query selector. But if you're doing a class selector, like if I do, I create that class as dot, W100. If you're using class, you usually want to use query selector all because that will return potentially multiple elements to you. Because again, elements can use the same class multiple times. Sorry, an element can use, a class may use multiple times by different elements. I don't know if I said that correctly, but hopefully you guys get the idea. So again, use the same syntax used for CSS selectors. Again, the dot, the hashtag, even like the, the angle bracket or the tilde, the same selectors apply here. Sorry. All right, query selector. So again, that's just another way to access elements from your HTML document. So as always, it's not as fun to talk about it. Let's actually take a look at an example. So again, I copied the example from our curriculum page. So if you guys want to follow along, I'd say just copy that and then paste that into your editor of choice. Get rid of that comment I added. Now let's talk about some of the items we added here. So we have doc type. We're familiar with this HTML tag, nothing special up to this point. But then we have our script tag. As I mentioned, this is an example of an internal script, but this JavaScript, so I actually need to use JavaScript commenting syntax. Internal. All right, so again, we open a script tag. Now I'm writing actual JavaScript here, right? This looks familiar to us, hopefully. Writing JavaScript, so I create that arrow function called show greeting. And then I have some logic here that's doing various stuff. We'll talk about what that's doing. And then I close my script tag. So this is the logic that I'm introducing here. I can reference this function now, so I created it here. So if you look into my body section, let me make some space here. So my body section here has some elements. I have a button element that is actually calling a function. So on click is an event that can happen. That's when a user actually clicks the button. On click is the default handler for that. It's going to call this function of show greeting. So notice I'm invoking it just like I would in JavaScript. I call the function name, have parentheses to invoke it, semicolon, probably can be left off, but kind of good to have that in there. So it's going to call this function and execute this logic when the user clicks on this button. Okay, let's actually take a look at our logic and see what's going on here. So let's break this up so we get more white space. On line 8 here, notice I'm using document. This is a pre-created object. It's not something I created. Document, you have access to that in your JavaScript automatically. So this document object, I'm calling get element by ID. So this is my HTML document object model. I'm calling get element by ID. And notice I pass input name. This is matching the ID down here. The unfortunate thing is that this can be really fragile, as in if I rename this to name something, I'm gonna just, my JavaScript, there's no magic way for it to know the actual name of this. You can go through your elements and actually extract ID if you want to do a little more dynamically. But in this case, I don't want to search for my input element in the DOM. I just want to access it directly by name or by the ID. So that's what get element by ID is doing. Again, you can find it yourself. If you navigate that tree, you can start with document, find all of its child nodes, and then all of those child nodes, you could find their children until you find the specific element that has an ID that we're looking for. It's going to do the same thing. In this case, I know the ID I want. So I get that. This gives me an object that represents that element. So name input is referencing this element from my HTML document. Likewise, I use document get element by ID to get another element. In this case, something that's ID output. So in this case, I have a div here that just has an empty paragraph. And that paragraph has an ID of output, hence the name up here. You guys following along? Any questions so far?
It's making sense. It'll be kind of fun to watch how this plays out.
Yeah.
Okay, I see. Okay, good that you guys are curious what's going on here. So then I have an if statement. This is just JavaScript shorthand. So in this case, if let's say this didn't return anything correct, this would be a null object. So in that case, this if statement would fail, because if name is null, this would equivocate or equal. Sorry, what word am I looking for? This would equivocate, I guess, to false, because if this is null, null is treated as a falsy value in JavaScript. That's why I'm doing this comparison or this condition where I'm making sure that these are non-null objects, meaning I probably got what I was looking for, right? So if both of these are valid, my goal here is to set the inner HTML, this is something we've not talked about, to some value. Inner HTML references the content of your element. Again, using a lot of terminology here, hopefully we kind of learned that on Monday. Element is a tag, content, and a closing tag. So in this case, this is, sorry, that's an example. My button has a tag. The tag is button. The opening tag is right here, what I've highlighted. We have some attributes, so that this is an attribute. The attribute has a name and a value. This submit portion is the contents of this element. And then I close that element with my closing tag. All right, so this is the content. If you want to access the content of the element, use inner HTML. Again, this is just looking up documentation or just knowing about it. There's no other magic way to know this exists. So inner HTML lets me set the value. So now I'm actually going to change the value of output. Right now I have nothing here. It's an empty paragraph, right? Nothing here. But I'm actually going to inject or insert some content into this element here via this line right here. All right, so let's actually see what this web page looks like. And then if there's any questions about what's going on, definitely want to make sure we're good. All right, bring up my web page. I like throwing it to a new screen. Let's make this a little larger. All right, so I have an input. This is an input HTML element. This is not something we covered in our introduction to HTML. So, we talked about paragraphs and headings and lists. Input is another type of element you can have on an HTML page that allows a user to enter values, right? So in this case, I have a placeholder that says name. So if I want to enter my name, so let's say my name is Bill Gates. Hopefully he doesn't mind my identity theft there. So I type in a name and I'm going to hit submit. Again, I go back to my HTML code. When I hit submit, this button is named submit. When I click that button, this on click handler is going to fire and basically execute what's going on here. So in this case, I'm calling a function.
Are you going to change name something?
Yes, thank you. You guys are always great at catching my co-pilots. Yep, so that was just a bad example. But in this case, input name is what I want. So when I click this button, it's going to call this function. And this function obviously is doing the items we talked about. So I actually need to refresh my page because I changed my JavaScript. Bill Gates. Let's hit submit. I'm going to click this. Notice I get a welcome message saying, hello, Bill Gates. How is this getting there? Again, we're writing that here. So we extract the value. So we have the name input, which is an object that has a property called value. Again, that's just something you had to know about. For inputs, value is the way to extract the actual value that the user typed in. So the user typed in Bill Gates. Name input dot value is going to be Bill Gates. That's what that is holding. We also add some string around it. So we say hello and then exclamation mark, set that to the inner HTML, which is going to basically insert it right here where my cursor is, right here. Let's add a comment, inner HTML set here. All right.
Ankur?
Yep.
What would cause name input to be false? Because if you just input an empty string, it's going to be, well, mine evaluate is true and just says hello blank exclamation mark. So what kind of cases is that name input and then greeting output looking for?
So did you have the dot value here?
Yeah, I just copied the code from.
Gotcha. And you're saying you're not seeing a name written there? Is that correct?
No. So I'm asking like name input.
Uh-huh.
Like if I put in like if I just hit submit, I don't do anything with the
Gotcha.
text field.
I
It
see.
says hello space.
Yep.
Right. So I'm wondering like what the logic is, like why we put that if condition in there, like what it's looking.
Gotcha. So this if condition is just looking for that we got the actual elements. So that example I was going with, so if I name this like X, now my document by get element by ID is going to fail, as in this is going to return a null object. So in that case, I don't want to try to do something if I don't have the valid elements. In this case, name.input is going to be null. So if I do a dot value on it, that's going to be bad behavior, as in it's going to be undefined. JavaScript, again, is going to go with the flow and be like, all right, I failed on this line, let me continue executing. We usually don't want to, use items that don't exist. So that's what this check is doing. But yeah, you're right. If we want to do another check, we could add another, another condition here, which probably makes sense. If we do name input dot value is not equal to empty string. Again, name that value is the actual string contents of what the user entered versus name input is an object. So you remember in OOP, an object contains properties and methods. So in this case, dot value is a attribute or a property of this object. So that's how I actually access the string value by doing dot value versus here I'm just checking, does this object actually exist? Yep, good question. So yeah, let's add that check. So if we have an empty string, we probably don't want to say hello to no one. So in that case, if I hit submit, notice nothing happens, clicking it repeatedly. But now if we actually enter name, Gates, oops, I broke it because I changed my name here. So that, again, in this case, name output is going to be null because this returns a null because it didn't find input name in the DOM. So I renamed it down here. All right.
So what happens if that test fails and we end up with an ID with no inner HTML?
You mean if this failed?
Yeah, if we don't do that, then later on we've got ID equals output with no inner HTML. What happens there?
Sorry, could you repeat that question?
We come back from that routine without setting the inner HTML for our output.
Yep. So then it's going to leave it as is. So in this case, it's blank, so it's going to leave it blank. So if you never set inner HTML, it's like whatever the HTML document had initially, that's what it's going to go to. Like, so this line isn't required for us to have anything there. So let's say we had something initially here. So let's say initial value. And I believe this is the case Don was saying. Let's say we fail at one of these gets element by IDs, as in our check here will be false because one of these will be null. So in this case, I rename this as /x. We're no longer going to execute this. So if I refresh my page, we have initial value. Again, this is the hard-coded item in our HTML file. This is the inner HTML currently that is set for this element. If we never update it, well, then it's never going to change. So, if I click something here or type something here, Bill Gates, hit submit, nothing changes. So this inner HTML stays the same because we're not getting into this if block because my name input is null because I named it incorrectly. If I take that away and now refresh, let's try that again. Bill Gates. All right, notice that changes the inner HTML. So again, whatever you have initially, that's again, what I guess that's kind of redundant, but whatever values you have in your HTML file, that's what's going to be initial values for inner HTML and value also. Like this, you could actually set a default value. So if I want to do value here, I'll just say by default, your name is Novak Djokovic. All right, so if I go refresh that. So, oops, how did I screw that up? Got my quote here. All right, so notice that this is pre-populated. So initial value, if I actually want that to be whatever the initial value is here, I could do that quite easily. Or not as easily, but okay, we'll do that. Sorry.
Okay, well, I see that having no inner HTML means it's an empty string. It doesn't mean it's invalid.
Correct. Yep. Yeah, you can set an empty string here, and that'll make it basically back to what we had before, which is nothing here. So yeah, you don't need to have an inner HTML. Again, paragraphs can be empty. You don't need content. So again, this is representing the content of that element. Okay, so we got something going on here. Let's actually move our script, because usually you don't want to have, especially as your JavaScript gets really large, you don't want to have like all that code just in your web page. A, because it's going to make your web page kind of harder to parse and read. And two, usually you want to reuse that logic in multiple web pages when you're creating like a full website. So it's better to kind of have a separate JavaScript file. So I'm going to create scripts.js file. And this is going to basically be what I have here. I'm going to copy everything between my script tags and drop that into my scripts.js. All right, there we go. JavaScript here. Now, if I want to link it, remember, you still need to reference it. There's no magic way that my index.html knows to read the JavaScript file. So to do that, instead of doing href, which we need to use the link tag and href for style sheets, we use scripts. We still use scripts, and we use src, and it's point to that file. So in this case, it's scripts.js, and then defer. Remember, that defer is going to say do it later. In this case, defer is not going to matter. So let's not always just say you need to do it. So just to highlight that, if I don't have defer here, it's fine. The reason it's fine is because the logic here does not execute until something happens on the page. So by that time, the page would have fully loaded. So when I click this button, my JavaScript will know about the DOM and have access to the DOM. So DOM should be built by then. But that's not always the case. So in this case, I don't have a defer. It's fine. So let's actually test this out. Get rid of my default value. And let's put initial value back here. Initial value. Okay. To prove that nothing's changed or everything still works, I have initial value. If I type Bill Gates, notice still works. Still finds this function. So I have show greeting. It still knows that exists or is able to locate it because I have show greeting in my script file that's linked externally now. The question is, why does defer matter in some cases? And let's actually tackle that question. So right now, I'm not going to have this defer here. Let's say I want to do something in my JavaScript. This is going to execute right when the script loads. So right when it gets to line 5, it's actually going to load this JavaScript file. So let's say I want to do something like alerts. Alert is a window function that you can have access to. So let's say hello. Let's put this outside. So this is no longer a function. It's going to execute right away. So name input, it's going to look for something called input name. And then this is going to say hello name input dot value. And this should be backticked. So I want to use string interpolation. Let's hopefully remember that. So basically I want to show an alert that says hello to whatever the input name is. I guess in this case, I want to put a default value back. So let's put value equals Novak Joko. Right. So this element has a default value. So the user does not have to enter anything. It does have a value that's provided. But in this case, the question is, will this be able to output it? So let's try it. Let's see what happens. I'm actually curious. So refresh. Try it this way. So when the window loads, I want to do something. Okay, that worked. That's curious. All right, so that's not what I want to do. So this alert's not going to work. Let's try it this way. All right, so I'm going to do the same thing I'm doing here, but not in a function. I guess I'll go that way. So. All right, so if I do it this way, these items won't exist. So, sorry, I am going all over the place. Let me just call this function right away. All right, so basically when this script executes, I'm going to call this function, and it's going to execute everything in here right away. That's probably the best way to do this. So if I get rid of this, refresh. So when I refresh, notice initial value is still initial value. But if I add that defer in here, this should change things. So if I add defer here, now my script is going to load after all of this good stuff loads once the DOM is fully created. So if I refresh this, notice I get this hello prompt. Why is that different? Well, the difference is without the defer, this file loads and automatically calls this function the first time. That function is going to execute line 3 and line 5. At that point in time, input name, that element does not exist in the DOM because it's still loading, right? We're on line 5 right now of the browser, kind of loading everything. So on line 5, none of this has been rendered or encountered by your browser. So this element never got added to the DOM because we're still on line 5. The key is defer. Defer will say, all right, do everything else first and then load this script. All right, does that make sense? What questions do you guys have about defer? What's going on in this example? Questions, comments, concerns, anything?
So I should probably know this. Who's Novak?
Pardon?
Who's Novak in your value?
Who?
So this person.
Oh, he's a tennis player.
Oh, okay. Well, that's why I don't know because I don't follow tennis. Thank
Gotcha.
you.
Fair enough. Yeah, he's a tennis player. He's one of my favorite tennis players. He's won the French Open, so he was kind of on my mind there. All right, so so let's continue on. Let's see what else we have to do. Okay, so we talked about the DOM and the document, how you can interact with different items. So again, you have access to a lot of things. You can update content. So that's the example we saw where we did something in our HTML and send it to new content or whatever content we wanted. You can do that with attributes also. So let's say I had an image that I grabbed from the DOM. I can have access to the SRC attribute. Again, this is a model representation of the element from the HTML document. So SRC is an attribute for HTML elements. In this case, it's going to be a property on my image object. In this case, if I want to set the image to donuts.png, I could just grab that image from the DOM, do .src, because that's a property or an attribute that I can set, and set it to whatever value I want to. You can also update some, CSS styles. You have access to the style attributes. So if I had a div, I do .style, which accesses the CSS styles. I can set whatever value I want. So let's say I want to update the background color or something. I can do style.background color and set it to whatever color or value I want. And this is a hexadecimal representation of color. So it's gonna be like a light gray. One thing I want to mention, so let's actually quickly do this. So make sure we understand this. So if I link rel to style sheets, that's what I'll link to. href will be called styles.css. And then I need to create that document. Let's do styles.css. What do I want to do here? Let's do the paragraph that we had. So I have output. I'm going to target that. So I'm going to do that by ID, hashtag output. And then I want the background color to be, let's just say some light gray initially. That's probably going to be a little too light. Let's make it BBBBBB. All right. So save that. If I refresh my page, notice that paragraph now has a gray background. Let's say I want to actually update that through JavaScript. I totally can. So the thing I want to point out here, properties in CSS usually use the format of dashes. So separate words are separated by dashes, right? So background dash color. This is a naming convention for CSS. However, in JavaScript, you can't name variables in that manner. So let's say I want to do that right off the bat. So let's say update paragraph. Let's just do it. Sorry, let's do it in our function here. So I'm going to do greeting output.style. Again, VS Code will give you a predefined list of it, so it's kind of helpful. But if I want to set background color, notice that background color is background, capital C, color. There's no dash here. Like the CSS property is background dash color. You can't do this in JavaScript. Like this kind of thing, you're trying to subtract something from this value, right? That's how JavaScript reads this. You can't use dashes or hyphens in JavaScript names. So in this case, it's going to automatically, the way you access is going to be through camel case. So instead of background dash color, you do background capital C color. And I can set this to, I don't know, whatever color I want. Let's make it maybe a nice shade of orange. All right, so we'll go with that. Now when I actually enter a name, refresh this, let's add Bill Gates, submit. Notice we got this nice, I guess, little yellowish orange, but now we change the color in addition to changing the content of that paragraph. Again, so you have a lot of control. You can change CSS styles. Just remember that note that I just told you. Anything that's dash, whatever in CSS, gets converted to camel case in JavaScript when you're trying to access that property. Okay, you can also access child elements. So if I want to add a new child, I can do that through JavaScript also. I'm not limited to whatever elements pre-exist here, right? Like these elements exist initially. I could add new elements to this document if I want to. So say I want to add a new paragraph here after this paragraph. Let's go about doing that. So I'm going to run this. Let's just say, call it const add paragraph. Get spell correctly, that'd be helpful. All right, so it's going to be a function. That arrow, not plus arrow. All this is going to do is going to get this div. So does that div have a name? Nope. Let's get it. Call that just parent for simplicity. So this div is called parent. I'm going to get that parent in my JavaScript. So let's get my let parents div equals documents get element by ID. And the name of that was parent. Simple enough. If I have a parent, I want to create a new child. So I'm going to do, let's say, let my new paragraph equals documents dot create element. Again, a lot of this will be looking up documentation online to figure out what methods or you need to call to create something. So create element. In this case, I want to create a paragraph element. So I'm going to put P there because that's the tag name. That creates a new element. Let's say the new paragraph will have new paragraph dot inner HTML. Set that equal to this is a new. Okay, so we created a new element. We said it's inner HTML. The last thing we need to do is actually add it to the DOM. The way we could add it to the DOM is by referencing the parent node. So in this case, I have parent div. I just do append child and pass it that element. So a new paragraph is what I created. So this will be a new child or new nested element within the parent div if I did everything correctly. Again, always good to check. So add paragraph, I'm going to execute that right away. So whenever the script loads, it's going to call add paragraph right from the start. So let's refresh. All right, there we go. This is a new paragraph element. Notice that did not exist here, right? We basically inserted, visually if you want to imagine it, we inserted a new paragraph here with this is whatever I wrote. Okay, you could also add an ID. So if you want to specify an ID, you would do that through here. You could do new paragraph, add,
Would it be like add tag or something?
yeah, there's a append attribute. I'm forgetting the name of it right now. Add attributes. Come on, VS Code, help me out. Oh, set attribute. All right, there we go. So set attribute. In this case, I want to set ID. And I want to set that equal to, I don't know, let's just say new B. So I could also set any attributes that exist. I could set that as needed. Okay, so notice inner HTML is the content. If I want attributes, I got to use set attribute. I could also use get attribute if I want to get a value from the attributes. But okay, so I think it's a good time to talk about the property inspector. So let's actually refresh this page. I'm going to do Command Option I. There we go. That's what I was trying to do yesterday. That brings up the developer tools. This is very, very, very handy. So get familiar with it if you're not familiar with it yet. This lets you actually inspect, your HTML as is right now. So notice I have a head section, I have my title, my script, and my CSS. If I look at my body, notice I have this new paragraph that I just inserted via JavaScript. This didn't exist initially, but it looks like I have the correct ID set. The content's correct. Again, looks like what I would expect. And you can modify this in place. If I want to change some values, I could say hello world. Notice that my page actually updates. This is all being done locally. I'm not actually modifying the back end HTML document. You could also use your console to execute some items. So if I want to do document, notice that I can actually inspect my document. This is the object that you get. So when you are using document, you have access to the DOM. So this is what basically your page looks like. In the same tree structure. You could execute stuff here. So if I want to do down here, that's what I want to do. Trash this. I could do an alert. Alert is a window function. So if I want to show something, it's say hello world. Notice I get a pop-up. So this is what the alert function does. It lets you show a pop-up on your web page. Basically, you run JavaScript through your console down here.
Uncle, I have a question.
Go for it.
What's Lighthouse? That looks new.
I am not familiar enough to say on it, but yeah, it might be new. I have no idea.
Okay, never mind. It already told me. Okay,
Gotcha.
thank you.
I didn't even notice it. Can only audit, blah, blah, blah. Yeah, I'm not even sure. You probably know more than I do at this point. Okay, cool. So property inspector, again, Command Option I on Chrome. It's similar on Firefox also, but lets you just kind of mess around with the HTML. Kind of, again, lets you look at items. So if I hover over this, notice I have my box model down here, kind of cut off. I zoomed in a bit too much, I think. So I have my box model here. So if I hover over my paragraph and inspect that element, notice I get all the particulars for that element. I get the content, no padding in this case, no border, there's a margin of 16. So when I highlight that, it highlights that on my page. Quite useful. So definitely get familiar with your property inspector. If you haven't been using it, maybe now's the time to kind of bring that up and kind of just go through your document and make sure you get familiar with it. Okay. Last section. So we should probably get done with this in 10, 15 minutes. Let's talk about local storage. So this is the idea where we want to persist data. When we're writing JavaScript or Python applications, we're persisting data in CSV files, basically creating external files where we can dump data in, and if we want to read data, we get access data from there. Similar concept, we can do that with browsers. So instead of writing text files, we can access some storage locations to store data for future use. So there's 3 different ways you could kind of go about storing data with a browser. One is local storage. So that's the one we're going to be focusing on. This is data that's persisted until a user manually clears their browser cache. So your browser is caching data. It's going to have a bunch of like login information, anything that you've done before, history also that's stored in your browser data. Local storage is one of those buckets that's in there. So you could drop values in there, and then if you need to retrieve them, you could access local storage. Assume the user hasn't cleared their cache, that value should still be there. Session storage, similar, but that data is deleted whenever that session is deleted. So when you close a tab, that closes that session. So the data that was stored for that particular tab gets wiped away for session storage. Local storage persists between instances. Session storage dies whenever that instance dies. There's also cookies. We've probably heard of cookies before. Outside of a snacking component, cookies in a virtual sense. It's basically like leaving a trail or like leaving breadcrumbs. I guess another food analogy. Cookies are a little different in that a server can access cookies on your machine. Local storage and session storage, a server doesn't have access to it. Only the client side has access to local storage and session storage. Cookies, on the other hand, can be accessed by a server. So for example, if you're going to a web page, the server might investigate your cookies on your local machine and say, hey, do I have like a username that I have access to already? And then the server can use that information to do whatever it wants to do. Versus local storage, session storage, that's more private, as in only the client side can access it. Okay, luckily, local storage is really easy to use, so this is not going to take too much time. So the way you use local storage is there's an object called local, again, _local, capital S storage. This is something that pre-exists. You don't have to create it yourself. It's similar to like document existing. Local storage has a method called setItem. Basically, you will you would store your data as key value pairs. You'll pass it a key, whatever value you want to store in your local storage. And then whenever you need to access it, you just call getItem with that key that you stored it with, and you get that value back. It's that simple. All right, so let's actually do a quick example and then we'll wrap up our lecture. So using our page that we have here, let's say we want to store our value. So this is on our curriculum page also. If you scroll down, I think we do it, or maybe I don't. Local storage, yep. So if you want to copy the code, you can. I'm just going to do it manually, but we can get rid of add paragraph. That's no longer of interest to me. But let's say we want to store the name once I enter it into local storage. How do we do that? So in my show greeting function, I'm going to opt to store the name if I have one. So I'm going to call local storage. Again, it's a predefined object. I'm going to call set item. And then let's set it to name with my key. And then my actual value will be name input dot value. All right, so now this should store it in my browser storage. I'll probably want to create a key that's consistent. So let's call it name key, equals name. The reason I'm doing this is because when I want to extract it, I want to use that same key. So if I need to change it, I should probably have it centralized in a variable. So I set it. Let's say when we load our page, we want to see if we can say hello to our user already. In this case, I'm going to do window.onload. This is a method that will execute when your window completes or is loading. So let's say when our window loads, let's actually see if we have a value in our local storage for name. We're going to do let name equals the local storage. So that's where I want to investigate. In this case, I'm going to do get item, pass it the key. In this case, name key is what I've created above, value of just name. So let's see if we get a name. So if name, then we want to say hello. So probably want to create a separate function. Say, call it const greet user. Just to have reusable code. So in this case, we want to do this, do this. I guess all of this is going to be down there. Name. Sorry, I'm going to clean up my code quickly. So in this case, if name outputs and then this condition. So I'm separating, I'm creating a new function for reusability. I'm just making it clear what I'm doing. Okay, so I'm losing you guys here. Name input, name value. I want to actually set my name in local storage here. Let's create a new variable called name. And then name equals my input value, like so. So use name here, and then I can call my function I just created. So greet user is what I had. So greet user is actually going to get my elements, check if that's valid, and then probably want to check if it's not empty. Then do what we're doing before. All right, the reason I did that was so I could actually call this function for my onload. I lost the bracket there. All right, so when I load, I want to call greet user also and pass it the name, assuming that name exists. And yeah, let's go with that. All right, so when the window loads, it's actually going to look in local storage, see if it has a name value. If it does, probably name not equal to empty string. It's going to call greet user, which should update that item we had before. So let's actually run this, and hopefully it works as we want. I'm going to refresh here, get rid of my console here. So notice we have initial value because we don't have a name that was stored in our storage. Let's say Bill Gates is what we want. So we hit submit. Something broke. Input name for this. Yep, this might be a great time to quickly debug. So I'm going to debug this. Close my window here. So I'm going to run my HTML file, hit start debugging, go in Chrome. But I had a breakpoint in my JavaScript, if you saw me put that in there. So let's actually enter Bill Gates. Okay, we hit our breakpoint. So let's actually investigate what's going on here. Name input looks like it's valid. I have something here that's non-null. I'm gonna step into it. Name input that value. Yep, name is Bill Gates. That looks correct. Local storage set item. There's something going wrong there. Nope, that seemed to work. Greet user. Let's continue on. Greet user failed. Why did that fail? Any thoughts here?
Don't you have to call the name by the name key and not by the value?
Where is this?
Line 18, right?
Oh, yes, you're right. Good catch. I modified code. Was that our error? Let's find out. Refresh. Okay, that works. Cool. So now Bill Gates should have been stored via line 9. That should be stored in our local storage. So if I actually close my browser, when I bring this up, I should expect hello Bill Gates to be there. If not, then I might have screwed something up, or maybe I'm lying to you. Who knows? So let me take away that breakpoint. Let's run this with debugging as Chrome. Notice this was pre-populated as Bill Gates. How's that happening? Well, let's open up our developer panel. Let's go to, where is it? Application. So there's an application tab here. There's a storage tab here in local storage. If I open that up, notice I have a key of name and a value of Bill Gates. This is what's been stored in my browser. So when I loaded my page, I was able to investigate local storage. I did find a name, so I was able to pre-populate that reading without the user having to hit submit. All right, so you can modify this if you want. Like if I want to change this, I could change this to Novak Shoko. All right, if I do that, save that. If I refresh this, notice this updates when I refresh the page, it automatically picks that up and uses whatever's in local storage. Okay, so you have access to local storage, you can modify it. If you want to clear it, you can do that from the console. So I could do something like local storage.clear, I believe. Is that not it? Why do I always forget this? There's a way to do it. Local storage clear. Google, you there? Storage.clear. All right. All right, maybe that cleared it. I don't know on the finds about. Let's actually check. Yep, so notice my local storage no longer has anything in it because I ran local storage.clear. Clear is a method on local storage. So now if I refresh, notice I get that initial value because my local storage doesn't have anything in it anymore. If I want it back, I could just go, Jeff Bezos, submit, and then go to my application. Right, there I have my key value pair that I got entered in there of just Jeff Bezos. If I refresh this, should be Jeff Bezos still. If I close this and come back to it, Jeff Bezos should still be the default value because my local storage has it. Okay, that covers local storage. I did briefly skip a section about adding event listeners. This is another thing you can do with, so talk about things you can modify. So content attributes, styles. You could also add event listeners. So there's a whole list of event listeners that you guys can kind of Google yourself. If I click here, down here. So again, certain elements have events you can do with it. So there's like mouse over, mouse click, or sorry, there's click, there's a mouse leave. If you kind of just look at which ones exist. So there is, keyboard events. So if something is users typing in an input, you can also capture that event so that if you want to react to it, you can do so. There's also mouse events. So again, if you mouse over something or mouse into something, you have access to that level of control. Click, again, is the common one for clicking on a button, but there's different ways you can go about it. Any questions about anything we went over? What questions you guys have about using JavaScript with HTML? Are you guys comfortable with it? Are you guys still kind of scared and ready to try it out and fail? And fail?
Yeah, I think it's time to play with it and learn it.
Again, hopefully it's nothing that's too over your heads, as in basically we're familiar with writing JavaScript for the past weeks. All we got to understand is how to access elements from a HTML document, and the way to do that is via the DOM. The DOM is just a pre-created object that gives you access to items by using methods such as get element by ID, get element by class name, whatever you're trying to do. So that's how you would access it. And also local storage, again, set item, get item, pretty straightforward. you can store information and then have that cached for future instances. Okay, we're gonna stop the recording here.